The road leading back to my grandmother's house felt both familiar and foreign. The asphalt cracked in places where time had worn it down, much like the memories I carried of this town. It had been over a decade since I last set foot here, my life pulling me away to bigger cities, to responsibilities, to everything that had kept me from returning to the only place that ever truly felt like home. But now, with my grandmother gone and her house legally mine, there was nothing standing between me and the place that held every meaningful moment of my childhood. I pulled into the driveway expecting dust-covered windows and an overgrown lawn, the echoes of a life once lived whispering through the walls. Instead, I found a freshly painted door, a neatly trimmed yard, and a moving truck parked out front, half filled with boxes that didn't belong to me. A cold realization crawled up my spine as I stepped out of the car, my hands tightening into fists at my sides. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. My name was on that will. That house was mine. A woman emerged from the house, her face unfamiliar but her expression one of annoyance, as if I was the one intruding. She barely glanced at me before turning to the moving crew, barking orders about which boxes needed to go where. Her voice sharp and businesslike. I took a slow, deep breath, my heart hammering in my chest as I approached. "Excuse me," I said, forcing my voice to stay even despite the storm raging inside me. "Who the hell are you, and why are you moving things out of my grandmother's house?" She turned, giving me a once-over like I was some stranger trespassing on her property rather than the rightful owner. "I'm sorry, who are you?" she asked, her tone clipped and dismissive. "I'm Ethan Carter," I said, my jaw tightening as I fought to keep my anger in check. "This is my grandmother's house, and I think there's been some kind of mistake." The woman's eyes flickered with something unreadable before she sighed, rubbing her temple like she had no patience for whatever conversation was about to happen. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone people use when they think they're explaining something obvious. "This house was purchased by my husband 2 weeks ago. It belongs to us now." The world seemed to tilt slightly beneath my feet, the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to process what she had just said, but none of it made sense. I was my grandmother's only living heir. I had the papers, the will, the proof that this house was meant for me. "That's impossible," I said, my voice sharp with disbelief. "I inherited this house. I have the legal documents to prove it." She sighed again, clearly frustrated. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. We bought it fair and square through the proper channels. You can talk to your family if you have questions, but as far as I'm concerned, this conversation is over." My family. My stomach twisted at the mention, the sinking feeling in my chest growing heavier by the second. There was only one way this could have happened, and I knew exactly who to call. Without another word to the woman, I turned on my heel, pulling my phone from my pocket as I marched back to my car. The line rang twice before my brother, Ryan, picked up. "Ethan," he said, his voice wary like he already knew what this was about. "Ryan," I said, struggling to keep my voice from shaking. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is." A long silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then finally he sighed. "Look man, it's complicated," he said, his voice full of the kind of guilt that confirmed everything I needed to know. "You sold Grandma's house," I said, each word like venom on my tongue.
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Without telling me, without asking, without any legal right to do so. "It wasn't just me," Ryan muttered, but that did nothing to ease the fury coursing through me. I slammed my hand against the steering wheel, my breath coming fast and sharp. "Who else? Mom? Dad? Who the hell thought they had the right to do this?" "Mom was the one who pushed for it," Ryan admitted, his voice quieter now, as if saying it out loud made it worse. "She said you didn't care about the house, that you wouldn't come back for it. She thought it was better to just sell it and split the money while we could." The betrayal burned hotter than I expected, a deep, searing ache that settled in my chest. My mother, my own mother had done this, had gone behind my back and erased one of the last pieces of my childhood as if it meant nothing. I took a shaky breath, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "And you didn't think to call me? To ask me if I wanted my own damn inheritance?" Ryan sighed again, and I could hear the regret in his voice, but it didn't change a damn thing. "I told her it was wrong," he said. "But you know how she is, Ethan. Once she makes up her mind." "I don't give a damn about her excuses," I snapped, my patience long gone. I want the truth, and I want it now. Ryan hesitated, but before he could answer, another voice spoke up from behind me. You're going to want to talk to your lawyer before you do anything stupid. I turned to see Jack Monroe, my grandmother's lawyer, standing a few feet away. His expression unreadable. He had been handling her estate for years, and if anyone knew the legalities of this mess, it was him. You know about this? I asked, my voice raw with anger. Jack gave a slow nod, tucking his hands into his pockets. I do, he said. And let's just say, they forgot to read the fine print. I stared at him, my heart pounding harder than before. What fine print? Jack tilted his head slightly, a small smirk appearing on his face, but there was something dark behind his eyes, something that told me this situation was far more complicated than I realized. Let's talk, he said. Because your family just made a very, very big mistake. Jack Monroe was the kind of lawyer who never wasted words, a man whose entire demeanor radiated quiet confidence, the type that made you uneasy even if you weren't the one in trouble. He motioned for me to follow him toward his car, a black sedan that looked like it had seen its fair share of tense conversations, and I didn't hesitate because at that moment, he was the only person who seemed to have answers. I barely noticed the autumn air turning crisp around me, the bite of the evening wind doing nothing to cool the anger simmering just beneath my skin. My own mother and brother had stolen from me, had lied to me, and now Jack was telling me they had made a mistake. I wanted to know exactly what that mistake was, and I wanted to know now. As soon as we were inside the car, Jack pulled a folder from his briefcase, his expression unreadable as he set it between us. He tapped his fingers against the leather cover before flipping it open, revealing a stack of documents with my grandmother's familiar signature scrawled across the bottom of several pages. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the papers, my fingers brushing against the cool, crisp edges. Your grandmother was a smart woman, Jack said, his voice steady, each word deliberate as if he was making sure I understood the weight of what he was about to tell me. She knew how families could be when money was involved, and she made sure no one could touch this house except for you. I scanned the document quickly, my eyes jumping from paragraph to paragraph, trying to process the legal jargon that filled the page. It was there, buried in the middle of a section outlining property rights, clear as day. Ethan Carter is the sole beneficiary of the estate, and the property is non-transferable without his written consent. My stomach clenched as I let the words sink in, the reality of the situation finally clicking into place. They had no right to sell it, I said, my voice tight with disbelief, the anger bubbling back up like lava threatening to spill over. They couldn't have even legally signed the paperwork. How the hell did this even happen? Jack leaned back against his seat, watching me carefully, his face unreadable. Your mother and brother either forged signatures or found a way to pressure the real estate agents into ignoring the conditions of the will. Either way, what they did was fraud, and that house is still legally yours. I exhaled sharply, my grip tightening around the document as my mind raced through every possible reason my own family would do something so blatantly illegal, so obviously wrong. It wasn't just about money. Not when they knew I would have gladly worked something out with them if they needed help. No, this was something else. This was desperation. Why would they do this? I muttered, more to myself than to Jack, but he answered anyway, his tone flat, his gaze sharp. That's the real question, isn't it? I didn't say another word as I shoved the papers back into the folder, my hands shaking with barely contained rage. There was only one way to get answers, and that was to go straight to the source. Without another glance at Jack, I pushed open the car door and stepped out, my breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts as I pulled my phone from my pocket. Ryan answered on the second ring, his voice cautious, as if he already knew I had found out the truth. We need to talk, I said, my voice cold, my patience non-existent. And I don't want any more lies. Ryan sighed, and in that single exhale I heard guilt, frustration, and something else I couldn't quite place, fear. Meet me at Mom's house, he said, his voice quieter than before. You're not gonna like what you hear. I barely remembered the drive over, my mind replaying every conversation I had ever had with my mother about the house, searching for any sign, any clue, that she had been planning this. When I finally pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, Ryan was already outside, leaning against his truck, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was tense, his jaw tight, his usual cocky smirk nowhere to be seen. You've got 5 minutes, I said, slamming my car door shut, my heart pounding in my ears. Make them count. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, looking everywhere except at me, and for the first time I realized just how deep in this mess he really was. Mom thought she was protecting you, he said finally, his voice strained. She thought if you got the house you'd start digging, and if you started digging, you'd find out things you weren't supposed to. A cold chill ran down my spine, my fists clenching at my sides. Find out what? Ryan hesitated, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. About Grandma, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. About what she did, and why that house should have never stayed in our family. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, my world tilting in a way that made me feel sick. Whatever he was talking about, it wasn't just about fraud, wasn't just about greed. This was something deeper, something dark, something that had made my own mother and brother willing to commit a crime just to keep me away from it. I didn't realize I had moved until I was already halfway to my car again, my mind made up before I even registered the decision. Where are you going? Ryan called after me, his voice laced with something dangerously close to panic. I yanked open the door, my jaw set, my hands trembling with barely restrained fury. To get my damn house back, I said, slamming the door shut before he could say another word. The drive back to my grandmother's house felt like a blur, my knuckles white against the steering wheel as I pulled up to the curb. The moving truck was still there, half unloaded, but this time I wasn't looking at the boxes. I was looking at the man standing on the porch, arms crossed, watching me with a cool, knowing expression. Victor Hale. The name didn't mean anything to me, but the way he looked at me, like he had been expecting me, sent another chill through my spine. He didn't move as I stepped out of the car, didn't even flinch as I stormed up the walkway, my heartbeat thudding against my ribcage like a war drum. You bought a house that wasn't for sale, I said, my voice hard as stone. And I want to know why. Victor tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Because, he said, his voice calm, almost amused. Some houses don't belong to the people who live in them. A slow dread settled in my stomach, cold and suffocating. And yours, he added, his eyes dark and unreadable. Yours never really belonged to your grandmother at all. Victor Hale didn't flinch under my stare, didn't shift his weight or glance away like most men did when confronted with accusations that carried serious weight. Instead, he looked at me with something disturbingly close to amusement, as if this entire situation was playing out exactly the way he had expected, as if he had been waiting for me to show up and demand answers like a fool who didn't understand the rules of the game. His presence in my grandmother's house, the way he stood so confidently on the porch of a home that legally belonged to me, sent a slow, crawling unease through my veins, one that felt deeper than anger, closer to fear. You keep looking at me like you think I stole something from you, Victor said. His voice smooth, too calm for a man who had knowingly purchased a house that wasn't supposed to be sold in the first place. But maybe you should be asking yourself why your family was so desperate to get rid of it in the first place. The words landed heavier than I wanted to admit, sinking into my chest with the weight of something I wasn't ready to unpack, something I hadn't even let myself fully consider. He wasn't wrong, not entirely anyway, because my mother and Ryan hadn't just sold the house for money, they had done it to keep me away from it, to stop me from uncovering something that clearly scared them. But why would my own family go to such lengths to keep me from a house that had been meant for me all along? What could possibly be so dangerous about a place that had once been nothing more than the heart of my childhood, the only constant in a life that had been filled with uncertainty and loss? You don't belong here, I said, keeping my voice steady, unwilling to let him see the doubt creeping into my mind like poison seeping through the cracks of a once solid foundation. Whatever you think you're going to find in that house, it's not yours to claim. Victor's lips twitched upward, not quite a smile but close enough to make my skin crawl, the kind of expression that told me he knew something I didn't, something he was waiting for me to figure out on my own. He stepped forward, closing the distance between us with a slow, measured pace. His gaze locked onto mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. Neither was it hers, he said, his voice dropping just low enough to send a shiver down my spine. His words carrying an implication that I couldn't quite piece together yet but knew I wouldn't like once I did. And I think deep down you already know that. I wanted to push back, to argue, to demand that he tell me exactly what the hell he meant by that, but before I could form the words, he turned his back on me and disappeared inside the house, closing the door behind him without another glance in my direction. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place felt strangely final, like a wall being built between me and the truth, and for the first time since I had come back to town, I realized that getting that house back wasn't just about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. It was about understanding why they had taken it from me in the first place. That night, I parked my car a few blocks away from the house, waiting until the last of the lights inside had gone dark, until the only sound in the neighborhood was the distant hum of insects singing their quiet, rhythmic chorus into the night air. My heart pounded harder than it should have as I made my way toward the back of the house, my breath shallow, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario that could play out if I got caught sneaking inside what should have been my own home. The idea that I even had to resort to this made my blood boil, but I knew there was no other way. If I wanted answers, if I wanted the truth, I had to find them myself. The back door had once had a lock that stuck if you didn't know the right way to jiggle the handle, a trick my grandmother had taught me when I was still young enough to think the world made sense, and as my fingers wrapped around the cold metal, I was relieved to find that some things hadn't changed. The lock clicked softly as I twisted it just the right way, and within seconds I was inside, my body tense, my pulse hammering against my ribs as I stepped into the dark, silent house. Everything smelled different. That was the first thing I noticed, the thing that made my chest tighten and my stomach churn, because even after all these years, my grandmother's house had always carried the same scent, a mix of old books, lavender, and something warm that I could never quite name but had always associated with safety. But now, there was something else beneath it, something that didn't belong, something rotting. I moved carefully through the kitchen, my footsteps slow, deliberate, my ears straining for any sign that Victor was still awake, that he had heard me come in. But the house remained eerily still, and as I moved deeper inside, past the familiar furniture and shadowed hallways, my eyes landed on something that made my breath catch in my throat. Door. Not just any door. Basement door. I had lived in this house for most of my childhood, had spent countless hours exploring every inch of it, had hidden in every closet and crept through every forgotten hallway, but I had never seen this door before. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing against the rough wood, the grain uneven beneath my touch, as if the door had been sealed shut for longer than I had been alive. There was no lock, no visible sign of resistance, but when I pushed against it, it didn't budge, didn't creak, didn't move at all. It was as if the house itself was refusing to let me in, as if whatever was behind that door wasn't meant to be found. A low voice cut through the silence, shattering the fragile moment of stillness, making every hair on my body stand on end. You shouldn't be here. I spun around so fast my vision blurred, my heart slamming into my ribs as my eyes landed on Victor, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me with a kind of quiet intensity that made my skin feel too tight, like I had walked straight into a trap I hadn't realized was closing around me. His expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed, but there was something in the way he stood, in the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides, that told me he wasn't surprised to find me here, that he had known I would come, that he had been waiting for this. My mouth was dry, my thoughts scrambled, but somehow I managed to speak. "What's behind that door?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but the words carried enough weight to fill the entire room. Victor's gaze flicked toward the basement entrance, his expression unreadable, but the slight twitch in his jaw, the barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders, told me everything I needed to know. "Something," he said slowly, his voice devoid of emotion, "that your grandmother never wanted you to find." Victor's words settled heavily between us, sinking into the quiet tension of the room like a stone dropped into deep, unmoving water. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat a slow, deliberate hammer against the growing sense of unease crawling beneath my skin. The way he looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable, told me that whatever was behind that sealed basement door wasn't something that could be easily explained, and worse, he already knew what it was. I forced myself to hold his gaze, to keep my voice steady even as my body screamed at me to get the hell out of there, to pretend I had never stepped foot inside this house again. "You keep talking like you know something I don't," I said, my fingers curling into fists at my sides, my voice edged with frustration. "If you have answers, then stop playing games and tell me the damn truth." Victor exhaled slowly, his eyes flickering back to the basement door for the briefest moment before settling on me again, his expression unreadable. "The truth isn't something you're going to like," he said, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful, as if he were debating how much to say. "But if you really want to know, you should start by asking your family about the brother your grandmother never mentioned." The word stopped me cold, my pulse stuttering in my veins as something unfamiliar twisted in my gut, a deep, unsettling confusion mixed with a sick realization that he wasn't just throwing out wild accusations. He had said it with certainty, with the confidence of someone who had been carrying that knowledge for a long time, and it made my hands feel unsteady as I took a slow, measured step back. "My grandmother didn't have a brother," I said, But even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow, uncertain, like I was repeating something I had always been told but had never actually questioned. Victor tilted his head slightly, his lips pressing together in something that wasn't quite a smile but carried the weight of amusement nonetheless, like he was watching me try to put together pieces of a puzzle he had already solved. "That's what they told you," he said, his voice laced with something almost like pity. "But this town hasn't forgotten." I didn't remember leaving the house, didn't remember the drive back to my mother's place, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, my mind a swirling mess of half-formed questions and fragmented memories that no longer felt as solid as they once had. My mother had lied to me before, had betrayed me when she sold the house behind my back, but this was something else entirely. When I arrived, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the living room lamp, casting long, flickering shadows across the worn carpet. My mother sat on the couch, a glass of wine balanced in her hand, her expression drawn, her shoulders tense, as if she already knew why I was there before I even opened my mouth. "Who was he?" I asked, not bothering with a greeting, not bothering to pretend I was in the mood for anything other than the truth. My mother's fingers tightened around the stem of the glass, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. For a long moment, she simply stared at me, something raw and painful flickering across her face, and that was when I knew, without a doubt, that Victor wasn't lying. I took a slow step forward, my heart hammering, my hands shaking, the silence between us stretching longer and heavier than I could stand. "Mom," I said, my voice quieter now, but no less urgent. "Who was he?" Her breath hitched, her gaze dropping to the floor as if looking at me would make it worse, as if saying it out loud would make it real in a way she had spent her entire life avoiding. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, like the words had to be dragged from a place she had buried deep inside herself. "His name was Henry," she said, and just the sound of it sent a sharp, cold ache through my chest. "He was your grandmother's little brother." I swallowed hard, my mind scrambling to process the weight of what she had just told me, the realization settling in like a slow-moving poison. I had spent my entire childhood in that house, had heard every story my grandmother had ever told, and not once, not a single time, had she ever mentioned having a brother. "Why didn't she ever talk about him?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt, but my mother only shook her head, her shoulders curling inward like she was trying to make herself smaller, like she was bracing for something painful. "Because he disappeared," she said finally, her voice cracking at the edges. "And everyone in town believed that she was the reason why." The air left my lungs in a sharp, uneven exhale, my mind stuttering over the words, over the implication of what she was saying, over the horrible, impossible thought forming in the back of my head. I took another step forward, the room suddenly feeling too small, too claustrophobic, the walls pressing in around me as I tried to make sense of the impossible. "What do you mean, he disappeared?" I asked, but I already knew. God, I already knew. That she wasn't talking about him running away, about him leaving town or starting over somewhere else. She was talking about something much worse, something much darker, something that explained why Victor Hale had known my name before I had even introduced myself. "He was never found," my mother whispered, her voice trembling now, her eyes glassy with something dangerously close to tears. "And the last place anyone ever saw him was inside that house." The words sent an icy shock through my veins, my entire body going rigid as the pieces of the puzzle snapped together in a way that made me feel sick. My grandmother had spent her whole life in that house, had lived there alone for decades after my grandfather died, had never spoken of her brother even once. And now I was beginning to understand why. I ran a shaky hand through my hair, my breath uneven, my thoughts spiraling into places I wasn't ready to go. "You think she—" I stopped, unable to say it, unwilling to let the words form into something real. My mother closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around her glass as she shook her head slowly, but when she spoke, there was no denial, no attempt to reassure me, no desperate plea to make me believe that my grandmother was incapable of something unthinkable. "I don't know what happened to him," she said, her voice hollow, haunted. "But whatever it was, she spent the rest of her life making sure no one ever found out." A slow, creeping dread settled into my bones, deeper and heavier than anything I had felt before, and suddenly, I understood why my family had been so desperate to sell the house before I could get my hands on it. Because they were afraid I would be the one to finally uncover the truth. The weight of my mother's words settled into my chest like a stone sinking into dark water, heavy and unrelenting, pulling me deeper into the realization that I had never truly known the woman who raised me, the woman who had spent her life sitting on a secret so buried, so carefully hidden, that no one had dared to speak of it until now. My grandmother had a brother, and that brother had disappeared inside the house that was supposed to be my inheritance, the house that my family had desperately tried to keep out of my hands, the house that now belonged to a man who knew far too much about things that no stranger should have known. I barely felt my mother's gaze on me as I turned toward the door, my pulse roaring in my ears, my body moving on instinct, as if the only thing that mattered now was getting back to that house, to him, to the man who had looked at me like he was waiting for me to put the pieces together. Victor Hale had known something from the beginning, had known about my grandmother, had known about the past that had been carefully erased, had known something that had made him willing to fight for that house, to claim it as if it had never been mine to begin with. I didn't bother telling my mother where I was going, didn't bother trying to explain the way my hands were shaking as I fumbled with my keys, my breath coming too fast, my thoughts colliding against one another in a frantic storm of half-formed realizations. As I sped toward the house, my headlights cutting through the darkness of the empty streets, one thought repeated over and over in my mind, looping like a broken record that refused to let go. That house was never meant to be ours. The words sat heavily in my chest, an unshakable truth that I had never even considered before now, not until I started to see the cracks in the story my family had always told, not until I started to question why my grandmother had held onto that house with such unrelenting determination, not until I saw the way my mother looked at me when she finally admitted that Henry had vanished inside those walls, that his name had been wiped from history, that my grandmother had made sure no one ever spoke about him again. I gritted my teeth as I pulled up to the house, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel as I caught sight of the figure standing on the porch, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his gaze fixed on me as if he had been waiting all night for me to return. Victor Hale didn't look surprised to see me, didn't flinch as I slammed my car door shut and stalked toward him, my jaw clenched, my mind spinning with too many questions that I didn't even know how to ask. "You knew," I said, my voice rough, unsteady with the weight of everything I had just learned, my anger mixing with something far worse, doubt. "You knew about Henry. You knew about my grandmother. You knew the second I walked up to this house that it should have never belonged to me in the first place." Victor watched me carefully, his expression unreadable, his stance unshaken, as if my anger meant nothing to him, as if he had already been through this conversation in his own mind 1,000 times. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying none of the emotion that was currently clawing its way up my throat. "It wasn't supposed to belong to her either," he said, and those words hit me harder than anything else he could have said, my breath catching in my throat, my hands curling into fists as the truth settled like ice in my veins. I took a step forward, my heart hammering, my stomach twisting into knots as I tried to grasp the full meaning of what he was telling me, as I tried to understand how deep this lie had gone, how far back it had stretched, how many people had been swallowed by it before I ever had the chance to see the full picture. "My grandmother stole this house," I said, barely recognizing the sound of my own voice, barely able to say the words out loud without feeling like they were tearing something apart inside me. "Didn't she?" Victor didn't answer right away, but he didn't need to. The silence was answer enough, the weight of it settling over us like a suffocating fog, thick and unrelenting, pressing down on my chest with a force that made it hard to breathe. He let the truth hang between us, let it seep into the air, let it consume me before he finally spoke again. "My grandfather was Henry Hale," he said, and I felt the world tilt beneath my feet, my balance shifting, my breath stuttering as the final horrifying piece of the puzzle snapped into place. "And your grandmother made sure he never left this house alive." The words were a hammer to my ribs, a sudden brutal impact that left me standing there, frozen, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything except stare at the man in front of me and realize that this was why he had fought for the house, why he had been so determined to take it away from my family, why he had looked at me with something close to pity from the very moment we met. I stumbled back a step, my head shaking automatically, my mind rejecting it, refusing to let those words settle into reality, refusing to believe that the woman who had raised me, who had taught me how to tie my shoes and wipe away my tears and love with my whole heart, had been capable of something so monstrous. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, my throat tight, my chest aching, the breath stolen from my lungs. "That's not possible. She wasn't like that. She took something that wasn't hers," Victor said, his tone matter of fact, his expression unmoving, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "She erased my grandfather's name, erased his history, took the house and built a life on top of something that was never hers to claim. I wanted to argue, wanted to deny it, wanted to fight against the truth. But the look in his eyes told me that I couldn't, that the story I had always believed had never been real, that the woman I had idolized had carried the weight of a stolen life on her shoulders until the day she died. My entire body felt numb, my legs unsteady beneath me, my hands shaking as I looked back at the house, at the dark windows staring back at me like hollow, empty eyes, at the walls that had kept secrets buried for decades. My grandmother had spent her life guarding something. And now, for the first time, I understood exactly what that was. She had been guarding the truth. The truth about what happened to Henry Hale. And the truth about how she had gotten away with it. The house stood in eerie silence, its darkened windows like empty, unseeing eyes that watched my every move as I approached, my breath unsteady and my pulse hammering hard enough to feel it in my throat. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the lock on the back door, the old metal giving way with an unsettling ease, as if the house itself had been expecting me, as if it had been waiting for someone to finally come inside and see what had been hidden for so long. The air inside felt colder than it should have, stale with the weight of dust and memories, the scent of aged wood and something deeper, something I couldn't quite name but that settled in the pit of my stomach like lead. I moved through the kitchen with careful, deliberate steps, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, my ears straining for any sound that might indicate Victor was inside, that I wasn't as alone as I wanted to be. But the house remained still, undisturbed, as if even time itself had stopped within these walls, as if the very foundation of this place had been frozen in the moment that my grandmother had decided to bury the past beneath her feet. I didn't hesitate as I reached for the basement door, my fingers brushing against the worn handle, the wood rough beneath my skin, my breath catching as I turned the knob and felt the slight resistance before the door groaned open, revealing a staircase that descended into absolute darkness. A wave of nausea rolled through me as I stepped inside, my hands gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles ached, my heart beat loud in my ears, each creaking step beneath me a painful reminder that I was treading in a place where something terrible had happened. The air grew heavier as I reached the bottom, the dim light from my phone casting jagged shadows across the cold, concrete walls, illuminating dust-covered shelves and rusted tools, relics of a life I had never known my grandmother had lived. My breath came shallow and quick as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, scanning the room until they landed on something in the farthest corner. Something that didn't belong in a basement filled with forgotten junk and discarded memories. A locked iron box. It sat alone, untouched by dust, the metal cold and unyielding beneath my fingers as I crouched in front of it, my pulse spiking with something close to fear but edged with desperate curiosity. The lock was old, rusted but strong, a relic of another time, and as I ran my fingers along its surface I just knew, that whatever was inside this box was what my grandmother had spent her entire life trying to keep hidden. My hands shook as I reached for the nearby shelf, grabbing an old crowbar covered in grime, my fingers tightening around the handle as I wedged it beneath the latch and pulled with everything I had. The snap of metal breaking echoed through the basement like a gunshot, sharp and final, my breath catching in my throat as the lid creaked open, revealing a collection of items that sent ice through my veins. Inside the box, beneath layers of crumbling papers and yellowed documents, sat an old leather-bound diary, its pages curled with age, its spine cracked from use. Next to it lay something far worse, something that made my stomach churn and my breath come in ragged gasps. A blood-stained shirt. I stared at the fabric, the deep rust-colored stains dried into the worn cotton, the sight of it making my skin crawl, making the air around me feel suddenly suffocating, making the walls feel closer than they had a moment ago. My fingers trembled as I reached for the diary, the leather cool beneath my touch, the weight of it pressing into my palm like it carried something far heavier than ink and words. The first few pages were nothing but old notes, grocery lists, meaningless scribbles that had no significance, but as I flipped further, as I turned to the later pages, the truth began to unfold in lines of slanted handwriting that felt like a ghost whispering from the past. He wouldn't stop crying. I told him to be quiet, told him it wasn't safe, told him he had to listen. But he was just a boy, and boys don't know when to be afraid. He didn't understand why I did it. He didn't understand that I had no choice. The words blurred before me, my breath coming faster, my heart slamming into my ribs as I flipped the pages faster, my eyes scanning the entries, each one worse than the last, each one spelling out a story I couldn't bear to read but couldn't force myself to stop. I heard them calling for him, heard their voices outside, but I knew they couldn't find him. They would take him away, and I couldn't let that happen. He was mine to protect, mine to keep safe. So I did what I had to do. I made sure they never found him. I dropped the diary like it burned me, the pages falling open to the final entry, the ink smudged, the words frantic, the handwriting sloppier than the careful script on the earlier pages. I thought I could live with it, thought I could carry it, but the walls know what I did. The house knows. And one day someone will come looking. Someone will come to take it all away. I can feel it in the floorboards. I can hear it in the silence. The sound of footsteps above me sent a bolt of panic through my chest, my breath catching as I snapped my head up toward the ceiling, my hands clenching into fists as the heavy thud of slow, deliberate movement echoed through the wooden beams. The diary lay open on the floor beside me, the blood-stained shirt still draped over the edge of the iron box, evidence of a crime that had been hidden beneath this house for decades. A shadow stretched across the stairwell, a long, dark silhouette that told me I was no longer alone. "You really should have left it alone," Victor's voice cut through the suffocating silence, calm but edged with something sharper, something dangerous, something that sent a slow, creeping chill down my spine. "Some things aren't meant to be dug up." I turned slowly, my hands still shaking, my body frozen in place as he took another step down. His expression unreadable but his eyes dark with something that looked almost like regret. "You found what you were looking for," he said. His voice lower now, quieter, like he was speaking to a man who had already sealed his own fate. "But if you don't stop digging, you'll end up just like him." The air in the basement felt heavy, thick with ghosts, the truth pressing down on me with an unbearable weight, and as I stared at Victor, I realized something terrifying. He wasn't warning me. He was telling me how this story always ended. The weight of the diary in my hands felt unbearable, its pages filled with a truth so damning, so irreversible, that I could barely bring myself to breathe as I turned it over, my fingers ghosting over the rough leather, my pulse hammering in my ears like the ticking of a bomb I had just activated. The blood-stained shirt lay beside it, a silent reminder that what I had found in that iron box wasn't just old words scrawled in ink, but the final confession of a woman I had spent my whole life loving, trusting, and believing to be good. My grandmother, the woman who had once held my hand and told me bedtime stories, the woman who had spent decades sitting in the very house where I had taken my first steps, had stolen a life, stolen a home, and built an entire legacy on top of a crime she had worked tirelessly to erase. Victor stood near the basement steps, his expression still unreadable. His eyes watching me carefully, like he was waiting for me to crumble beneath the weight of what I had just uncovered, like he had already seen this moment play out before and knew exactly what would come next. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that none of this made sense, that there had to be a reason, that my grandmother couldn't have possibly done what the pages in my hands claimed she had done, but no matter how many ways I tried to rearrange the facts in my head, they all led back to the same undeniable truth. She had taken Henry's life. And in doing so, she had taken this house, stolen a future that wasn't meant to be hers, rewritten history so completely that even my own mother had spent her life pretending the past didn't exist. "You have a choice to make," Victor said finally, his voice quieter now, but still carrying the same calm certainty he had possessed from the very beginning. "You can take that diary, take that shirt, take all the proof you need, and you can tell the world what your grandmother did. You can expose the truth, drag your family's name through the mud, make sure that everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of woman she really was. But if you do that, you'd better be prepared to burn everything down with it, because once you light that match, there's no putting out the fire." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my mind spinning as I tried to piece together what he was really saying, what he was offering me beneath the carefully chosen words. He wasn't just giving me an option, he was warning me. "And what happens if I walk away?" I asked, my voice hoarse, the question barely more than a whisper. Victor let out a slow breath, his eyes flickering toward the open diary for a brief moment before returning to me. His gaze steady, unwavering. "Then this stays buried," he said simply. "The house remains mine, your family keeps their reputation, and you go back to your life knowing that some truths are better left unearthed. No one has to know what you found down here. No one has to suffer for sins committed before you were even born." I wanted to believe it was that simple, that I could just shut the box, close the door, and walk away without looking back. But something about the way he said it, the way his voice held that slight edge of something resembling pity, made my stomach twist in unease, made the air around me feel suddenly suffocating, as if I was teetering on the edge of something I could never come back from. "I need to talk to my brother," I said after a long moment, my voice steadier than I expected, my decision not yet made but the need for answers outweighing everything else. "If I'm going to make this choice, I need to hear the truth from him first." Victor didn't try to stop me, didn't argue, didn't push for me to decide right here, right now, and that in itself unsettled me more than anything else. Instead, he simply gave a small nod, stepping aside to let me pass. His expression unreadable as I walked past him, gripping the diary so tightly in my hands that my fingers ached. The drive to Ryan's place felt longer than it should have, every streetlight casting long shadows over the road, every quiet moment inside the car filled with the sound of my own heartbeat, too loud, too uneven, too heavy with the weight of what I had to do. I wasn't sure if I was walking into a conversation that would finally give me the closure I needed, or if I was about to step into one final betrayal, but one way or another, I was done being kept in the dark. Ryan answered the door almost immediately, his expression guarded, his eyes flickering down to the diary in my hands before he let out a slow, resigned breath and stepped aside to let me in. The living room was dimly lit, the air thick with an unspoken tension, and as I turned to face him, I could already see the truth in his face before I even opened my mouth. "You knew," I said, my voice hollow, the words cutting through the silence like a knife. "You knew what Grandma did. You knew about Henry. You knew that this house was never supposed to be ours." Ryan ran a hand down his face, his shoulders slumping as he let out a long, tired sigh, the kind that came from holding onto something heavy for far too long. "I didn't know everything," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual, lacking the usual confidence he carried himself with. "Mom told me bits and pieces when I got older, enough to make me understand why she never wanted you near that house, why she was so desperate to sell it before you had a chance to start asking questions. She thought she was protecting you, Ethan. She thought if she kept it hidden, we could just move on and pretend none of it ever happened." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head, my grip on the diary tightening. "And what about Victor?" I asked, my voice sharp now, the anger I had been holding back starting to crack through. "Did you know who he really was? Did you know that the man you let buy that house was Henry's grandson?" Ryan flinched, his jaw tightening, his eyes closing briefly before he let out another breath, this one heavier than the last. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew." The word sent a fresh wave of anger through me, hot and blinding, my hands shaking with the urge to throw the damn diary across the room, to scream, to demand why he had kept this from me, why he had let me walk blindly into a past I had never been given the chance to understand. But no amount of yelling would change what had already been done. No amount of anger would erase the fact that I was standing at the edge of a decision I couldn't undo. I could take this diary and expose the truth, shatter the illusion of the woman who had raised me, burn my family's reputation to the ground, and let the whole town know that the house my grandmother had loved so fiercely was nothing more than a stolen tomb built on a lie. Or I could let it go, walk away, bury the past like she had done, and pretend that some ghosts were better left to haunt the walls in silence. Ryan watched me, waiting, his expression a mix of guilt and something else, relief. Because he already knew. He already knew what I was going to choose. The flames licked hungrily at the edges of the diary, curling the pages inward as the fire swallowed the ink, turning words into smoke, turning history into ash, turning truth into something that could no longer be held, no longer be read, no longer exist beyond the flickering embers that danced inside the metal barrel behind my mother's house. The night air was cool against my skin, but the heat from the fire stung my face, burning my eyes as I watched everything I had uncovered disappear, consumed by the choice I had made, by the decision that would ensure no one would ever know the full story, that no one would ever be able to drag my grandmother's name through the mud, that no one would ever have proof of the crime that had kept our family standing for generations. Ryan stood beside me, silent, unmoving, watching as I fed the last of the documents into the flames, his face unreadable, his hands shoved deep into his pockets like he was afraid of what they might do if he let them hang at his sides. Neither of us spoke as the final pages blackened and crumbled, as the last physical remnants of Henry Hale's existence were reduced to nothing but soot, as the past was swallowed whole by the very same silence that had hidden it for so long. I thought burning it would feel like closure, like an ending, like a way to finally bury what had been unearthed, but as I watched the last ember flicker and die, I realized something that sent a cold, sharp certainty slicing through me. This wasn't an ending. This was just another grave. Ryan shifted beside me, letting out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping slightly like he had been holding himself together just long enough to make sure I didn't change my mind, just long enough to make sure that I did what he had always known I would do, just long enough to make sure that the past would stay buried where it belonged. "You did the right thing," he said finally, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, as if saying the words too loudly might somehow make them feel less true. I didn't answer right away, didn't acknowledge the relief in his voice, didn't let myself believe that what I had done was anything close to right. Instead, I just stared into the empty barrel, at the faint glow of cooling embers, at the last physical evidence of what my grandmother had done, and wondered how long it would take before I could look at myself in the mirror without wondering who I had really been protecting. The next morning, a thick fog clung to the streets, muffling the world in a way that made everything feel slower, heavier, as if the town itself was still asleep, unwilling to wake, unwilling to acknowledge what had been lost in the darkness of the night before. I had barely slept, had barely moved from my spot on the edge of my childhood bed, had barely let myself close my eyes for fear of what I might see when I did. But as I stepped outside, as I prepared to leave this town behind for the last time, I found something waiting for me on the hood of my car, something that sent a sharp, cold unease crawling up my spine, something that made me realize that no matter how much I had burned, no matter how much I had tried to erase, some truths refused to die. Letter. No stamp. No address. No name written on the front. Just a single folded piece of paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper, weighted down as if to make sure the wind wouldn't carry it away, as if to make sure I would see it before I left, as if to make sure that I knew that this story wasn't finished, that the past didn't just let go because I had tried to silence it. My stomach twisted as I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the damp paper, my breath catching as I unfolded it and saw the single sentence written in dark, careful handwriting, the ink slightly smudged but the words still unmistakable. You only burned the story she wanted you to find. My blood ran cold. I turned sharply, scanning the quiet street, searching for any sign of who had left it, searching for any movement in the fog, any shadow slipping between the houses, but there was nothing. No one. Just the eerie stillness of a town that had gone quiet before dawn, just the unsettling knowledge that someone was still watching, still waiting, still pulling the strings of a truth that I had barely begun to understand. My hands trembled as I crumpled the letter in my fist, my pulse roaring in my ears, my mind racing with possibilities, with questions, with a sick realization that no matter how much I wanted to believe I had buried the past, no matter how much I wanted to convince myself that it was over, I had only burned what had been left behind for me to find. There was more. And someone wanted me to know it. I drove in silence, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, my stomach a tight knot of unease that refused to unravel, my mind stuck on the implications of that single, carefully chosen sentence, the warning hidden between the lines, the unshakable knowledge that I had played directly into someone's hands. The roads blurred beneath my tires, the weight of the town fading behind me as I crossed the county line. But no matter how many miles I put between myself and that house, no matter how many exits passed in the rearview mirror, the feeling of unfinished business pressed against my ribs like a vice, a quiet, unrelenting whisper reminding me that I had only scratched the surface. By the time I reached my apartment, the sky was already shifting into dusk, the weight of exhaustion settling heavy in my bones, my body aching with the need to sleep, to forget, to pretend that I had done the right thing. But as I unlocked my door, as I stepped inside and dropped my bag onto the couch, my phone buzzed once in my pocket, the sharp vibration making my stomach drop before I even had the chance to look at the screen. Message. No name. No number. No trace of who had sent it. Just a single sentence that sent ice through my veins, that turned my exhaustion into something far worse, something far heavier, something that made the world tilt slightly beneath my feet. Some houses aren't haunted by ghosts. They're haunted by the truth. I swallowed hard, my breath uneven, my heart pounding as I stared at the words glowing against the screen, my mind spinning with the realization that this wasn't over, that it would never be over, that no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to bury it, the past would always find a way to surface. Because the thing about the truth, the thing about the ghosts that lurk in the places we try to forget, is that they don't just disappear when you stop looking. They wait. And one day, when you least expect it, they knock on your door.